Welcome to History 1112. First of all, this is a PowerPoint that's meant as simply an introduction to the course. I want you to relax. This is material that should help you kind of ease into the course, shall we say. It's a long video, and I suggest you look at it in bits and pieces. And it's just to kind of fill in like what happened before 1415 when we start the course. I don't know what your background is. Some of you know very little about world history. Some of you may have taken history 111, which would have been like ancient history. I don't know if you know much about the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. So this PowerPoint is simply meant to give you that kind of a background. I can't make you watch this. I would suggest you watch it. It'll make the course, especially the first couple of weeks, much easier for you. As I said, it's long, so break it up, do a little bit at a time. Hopefully it doesn't put you asleep. Hopefully you find something very interesting about it, and I'll ask you about that later. What did you find the most interesting, and what did you find that was the most important? I can promise you one thing: you're going to come up with some great ideas for Halloween costumes from this PowerPoint. So bear with me on this, okay? So here we can see some of the major civilizations in the world, especially when we start this course. You may recognize some of them: Islamic, Greek, Western referring to European, Western European, which our course really focuses on, and of course Chinese. And so as we begin, once again, what are we going to do with this? First of all, I'm going to introduce to you some of the major players that shaped the West. And the first one, of course, are the Greeks. And look at the dates: 1,900 years before Christ. And they stabilized about 800 years before Christ, creating a major civilization. And this piece of architecture is what they are famous for to this day. Here you get a map just showing you how far and extensive the Greek Empire was. You'll notice that it extended far into the east, especially under Alexander the Great, into India, in fact, parts of Afghanistan. And to this day, you can find some Greek culture in some of these areas where which the Greek influenced a great deal. In terms of warfare, to remind you, there's no gunpowder weapons at this point. And these long spears basically was a jabbing type of weapon is what they used, and they were very effective in combat. Here's the so-called Spartan, which was one of the Greek city-states, the phalanx. And you can see how the men behind would push the first row forward as they jabbed their way to victory. This is a more modern view of this. Now, much of this PowerPoint you don't need me for, and you can stop it, of course, and go forward and go back and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes I'll talk a lot, sometimes I'll say very little. But one of the things I do want to stress, because this is where we begin the course, was the 1415 Renaissance or rebirth, and they were totally taken with Greek philosophy, which they felt had been neglected for hundreds of years. And the Greeks, to this day, we owe great debt to them because they passed on to us something called humanism and philosophy as we know it. Humanism is nothing that's complicated. Look at the word human. And basically, it's a philosophy about us. They were very much concerned about us, our needs, our views of looking at the world and so forth. It's not primarily on gods or God, okay? Not that they didn't have gods, of course, but it's a philosophy about us, basically, okay? Every time you look in a mirror, right? You care how you look, straighten your jacket, look at your complexion. That's a form of humanism. You care about yourself. And there were times in early history when people didn't care too much. Think about, by the way, before they had mirrors, you never actually saw what you looked like very well unless you looked into a lake or pond. And as you know, that's not often very good. We take for granted that. But think about that. No mirrors. How did people perceive themselves? Okay. Philosophy, they gave us their views on astronomy, mathematics, political philosophy, ethics, which means how do you treat people, metaphysics, are there things beyond what we can physically see and touch, biology, rhetoric is how to form a good argument, which is a very valuable skill today, and aesthetics is about beauty. What is beauty? And these are some of the questions they ask, and you can see why we call this humanism. And by the way, philosophy means love of wisdom, which I hope we should all have. What is real? Is there a best way to live? Is it better to be just or unjust? Do we have free will, or is everything preordained and we are simply, victims? Here, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are names you should have heard of before. These are the three great philosophers, and these are the questions they wrestled with. Remember I said this is just background material for it, but when we start the course of the Renaissance, we're going to be picking this up. You'll hear the names Socrates and Plato, Aristotle again, okay? Greek contributions. They gave us a lot of our political ideas, such as what is a tyranny, ruled by a harsh dictator, oligarchy, ruled by a few, democracy, by the people, and despotism is, once again, like tyranny, government run by usually a harsh dictator or group of people. Now, the classical virtues, they believe that architecture in particular, even art, order, balance, symmetry, which means both sides should be equal, clarity. These are all things that you find in the way they developed architecture and language. Okay, they gave us the poem, the drama, orations, history, philosophy, science. So you can see why this is so important. And this idea that we are dignified creatures, we're master of our feelings. And they also had an emphasis on physical beauty. They really emphasized the body beautiful, which once again, our culture has picked up on. The Parthenon, let me go back, is the piece of sculpture that really emphasizes this. Look at the symmetrical, the left versus the right, very stable, very organized, okay? And we see this throughout Greek architecture. Do you have buildings in your town where you see columns like this? If you do, then that's the Greek influence. Here's Nashville, Tennessee. This type of architecture is still very popular, and there's a rendition of this. Here it is in ruins, and here it is a modern version of it. I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and this is their town hall, and they have an auditorium right next to it. 1913 it was built. See, there you go. And the bell tower is in the middle. There you go with the body beautiful. When you look at Greek art, very often there are a lot of nudes, and later as they develop their skill at this, you notice that S curve, what we call it. The weight is on one leg and the other leg is in a relaxed form. And they had no problem showing the body this way. Very athletic, very toned. And of course, this fits into us today, isn't it? Look at how today we are still concerned with the body beautiful, more than we should be probably, right? So this is all part of the Greek contribution to our culture. Not all cultures believe the body should be shown that way. And you'll find in almost every religion, a conservative strain where hair should be covered. Now this obviously is an Islamic woman wearing a burqa, but nevertheless, that the body should not be shown except in the privacy to a husband, for example. Now, the Roman world, they replaced the Greeks, and you can see the dates here, 500 years before Christ to 476 years after the death of Christ, or the modern era, as we call it. And you can see the Roman Empire is much more vast, and it covers the era that we'll be covering in this course. And the stages of the Roman expansion just shows you how over time they got bigger and bigger. Go back to that one, a little bit easier to see. And you notice Britain was part of the Roman Empire for a while, and parts of Egypt. Judea is where Jesus Christ was born. Now, the Roman army was also obviously a very good army to conquer an area that big, and their skill was with mostly their sword and a more short but jabbing routine. There you can see with their shields. And when they conquered a nation or a people, they would bring the captives and all the loot they took, and they had what they called a triumph through downtown Rome. And of course, the word triumph is a word you're all familiar with. Triumph is a victory. Okay. Their contributions, aqueducts, durable roads, splendid structures like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, not the Parthenon, this is a Pantheon, important engineering skills, law, literature, science, technology, all these things they will add to our culture. Okay. Roman law. To run an empire that big, they had to have a law that superseded all local laws, and they developed really strong administration and government structures. Now, under Roman law, no custom is necessarily right, because every country they conquered had their own laws. So Roman law was above those other laws. Notice the last sentence. Roman law favored the state or public interest as seen by the government, rather than the interests or liberties of individual persons. That's very important, because later in the course, you'll notice that the kings of Europe will have that kind of power and will be based on Roman law. Kings loved Roman law. It's basically They couldn't be found guilty of anything because they were above the law. Later, we'll see that we will challenge that. American history, of course, is a challenge to the rule of kings without representation of the people. They're above the law. They gave us a body of civil law. How about, you've all heard of this before? Concept that accused is innocent until proven guilty. And the Roman law served as a basis for the legal practices in Western Europe, as well as their colonies, meaning the United States. Okay. And some of that is still used today. Now, how is this different from Greek architecture? It's the arch, notice. They developed the arch. The Greeks didn't know how to do that. They were good with columns. So you can see the influence of the Greeks, but the arch is a key Roman contribution. And these are their other contributions. These bridges, the theater, the circus, as they would have called it, the Colosseum, temples, architecture, okay? And there it is. Concrete is another one of the great inventions, which I don't have to tell you is something that we use all the time in our own world. It's the arch and those vaults. This later becomes the basic form of a Catholic church. Okay, the barrel vault going down the middle. Okay. And there's modern concrete. Their concrete is still some of the best, better than our modern concrete, and it still lasts today. Okay. And the reason for this is much of their cement was also included volcanic ash. Okay, and this is just once again kind of like a interesting tidbit. And that's why their roads and so many of their buildings are still in existence today. Okay. And there's one of the largest unreinforced concrete domes. Remember, this is the Pantheon in Rome. It's one of the few Roman structures that is still around, and you can walk into it. It's really something to see. And think of our Capitol building. You can see how that would be influenced by this. And Roman roads. Now you can read this yourself. You don't really need me. This is so much of the PowerPoint is like this. So I will go through this, and of course you can stop this and read it carefully, even though I'm moving through it fairly fast. And this is how they kept their empire together. Okay, the roads tied the empire together. It's probably one of the reasons too why Christianity, when it did spread, it spread so rapidly through the Roman Empire, was because of the roads. And there's one today, what it looks like, a Roman road. Point de Garde, which is an aqueduct carrying water. And they had running water in many of their cities. And once again, very important to building a civilization. And this is in France. And as you can see, it's still in excellent shape. Now, during the Roman Empire, this is when Christianity was established. We think that Jesus was probably born around 33 by our calendar AD, and of course was crucified, died fairly young in his 30s, and yet it spread. And this is one of the most remarkable things, how Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, as I said, with the help of roads and ships probably. And of course, the man mostly responsible for that is Paul. Paul was the great person responsible for spreading Christianity, because after all, Jesus was crucified, never left the Holy Land, and at the very, well, back then it would have been a pretty average age in his early 30s. And eventually, the Roman Empire became Christian. And this is very important when this Emperor Constantine decided to allow Christianity to be the dominant faith. He felt Christianity, he saw in the clouds in the sky, the symbol of Christ, and he thought that was one of the reasons why he won his great victory. And eventually he allowed Christianity to dominate the Roman Empire, and he himself on his deathbed became a Christian. Now, this is another word you should know, because eventually there'll be a split between the Roman Empire, between the eastern part of the empire, which we call Byzantium, and the Roman Empire. Okay. Now, the Byzantine Empire, you'll hear this word in the course, is the Eastern Roman Empire. Okay. And its capital was Constantinople, whereas in the West, the Roman Empire, of course, the capital was Rome. And today, of course, today it's mostly a Muslim country, but Istanbul is what the new name for Constantinople. Okay. And there's a map. You can see Turkey. This is a modern day map of Turkey. And you can see Constantinople is where Istanbul is. Look at Istanbul. That's the modern name for it. And you can see the Black Sea, which goes through that straits and then into the Mediterranean. There's another view of it. Okay. The Bosphorus is the straits, and the Dardanelles are the two straits. So you get to the Black Sea. And this separates, and many people feel, Europe from Asia. And there's like a neat map, a satellite image of those Bosphorus Straits that you could see on the previous slide. Okay. And that's a view of the modern city of Istanbul today, the European side. So where this person was sitting or taking this picture, he was in Asia. On the other side, you can see Europe, and you can see it's a very modern city today. There's another picture of viaducts. If you're just wondering what they look like, this is one of the longest in the world. And once again, it's a Roman contribution. That's why I just put it in here as an FYI for you. Okay, that's where it's located, in France. So I do want you to know that there was a Roman Empire, and it's split in two in 1054. And this is important because to this day, there are two major religions that came out of this. On the east would be called the Orthodox Church, the true church. And on the east, on the west, it's called the Catholic Church, meaning universal. Many of you might be Catholic. And where does that come from? It's from, you can see the purple areas here. Now, on the eastern side, the Orthodox faith, it's very prevalent among Greeks and Ukrainians and Russians, and it's called the Orthodox Church. They do not recognize the Pope in Rome, and they have their own father figure called the Patriarch. And to this day, these religions are divided. I think they're very close in their beliefs. I think the biggest difference between them is that the Orthodox Church does not believe in the Pope as the leader. And of course, if you're Catholic, the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church. Okay. Now, some of Christianity's contributions, their views on love, was not the body beautiful so much, but also what we might call beauty within us. That even an old person who's not very physically beautiful can be a loving person. And that life is really a lot of suffering, but you're promised in the hereafter, if you will, that eventually through the suffering, you'll end up in heaven. There's one universal faith for all, that's Catholic. And there's no Protestant churches yet. That's very important. Some of you, if you happen to be Protestant, like Methodist, Baptist, or some other religion, they do not yet exist. And that's where we'll get into that when we start our course. In terms of political thought, St. Augustine, a very important Catholic saint, said the city of God should dominate, meaning that gods should dominate politics, the city of God, and that when people live in sin and they follow worldly leaders, that leads them to the devil, and that would be the city of man. Now, the Western world escaped from Caesaropapism. Now look at two words there, Caesar and papism. Caesar meaning an emperor, and papism is referring to the Pope. And notice Caesar comes first. Now in the East, you'll find out that very often the leader, the king or the emperor had most of the power. In the Western world, meaning what is today the Catholic world of France and Germany and back then in England and so forth, it was not that way. It was the opposite. So the Western world escaped from that. And the popes will always question the power of the kings in the Middle Ages. So good over evil, God versus Satan, becomes a big factor in Western culture. And we'll get into this when we start our course, okay? That's Michael, the archangel, driving Satan and his cohorts into hell. And you can see on the right, this same idea here of the city of God on the top. Okay, another thing you should probably know from movies is that as the Roman Empire fell apart, barbarian and German tribes started to infiltrate and migrate into the empire. First, they were used by the Romans to build up their own armies, and eventually they struck out on their own. And the rise of the Germanic peoples, these are some of the different tribes that came into Europe. Okay, here's a map showing it. Now, what's important for you, your DNA, many of you are going to have the DNA from these groups. Notice these people will eventually found modern countries. Notice Anglos and Saxons up north going into England. And the Franks will create Frankreich or France, for example. And the Vandals, even to this day, you know what it means to vandalize something. So these had to be pretty tough people, probably doing a lot of damage, rape, pillaging, and plundering. for their word, their name, Vandals, to become, have a very negative meaning in Western culture and the English language. Okay. And that's Europe during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages refers to the time of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance, when Europe starts to make major inroads and start to become a very important, powerful political and economic entity. So the Middle Ages are in between there. Now, these are not modern countries. There's Byzantine Empire. Remember, I said Byzantine, Byzantium, Eastern Orthodox. Outside of that is all Catholic, except for when you get to Kievan Rus, Russia. And this is also part of Ukraine, where the war is going on right now. And this is very important. Look at how Kievan Russia controls so much of this. This was the heart of the Russian Empire. And this is one reason probably why Putin and the Russians today feel that the Ukraine should be part of their own country. Putin would like to see the Ukraine be incorporated back into Russia because their roots are actually in Kiev. Okay. There's Europe today. Where did your ancestors come from? Now, they could have come from Africa, of course, which later become very much an important part of our story with the slave trade and so forth. But if you are Caucasian or white in particular, or have DNA blood from this group, well, it might be French, it might be Spanish, Portuguese, a lot of Portuguese in this country today, from the islands especially. And there's Italian, Germany, London, Irish, etc. That's what it looks like today. But back then, you can see the difference. Another view of Europe. I wanted to put this one because you can see where the modern Ukraine is, and there's Russia. So if you go back to this, go back one, I should say, you can see it doesn't really show you that well. Now, also at this time, another group came in, Attila the Hun. This is a group out of Asia, of course, and they also were one of those barbarian tribes that came through and devastated, and they actually conquered Rome and sacked the city and so forth. Another group called the Vikings. You're familiar with them. I think there's a number of movies out about the Vikings. I think they're on HBO or some of the other cable stations. There's been countless movies about them. And their longships, of course, they raided the coasts of Europe. They actually infiltrated all the way into Russia using the river system and helped create the Kievan, or the first Russian state. In fact, the word Russia actually refers to Ruslan, which we think was a Viking territory. And therefore, that's where the word Russia comes from, a kingdom that was created by the Vikings. That's another illustration of them, their famous longships. And we call this the early Middle Ages. Once again, there is no Europe yet. Rome is falling apart, these various tribes, Celts. By the way, Celts is what we pronounce that. The Scots and the Irish are Celts. Notice the basketball team, we call them Celtics. I think why are they called Celtics instead of Celtics? I think just to distinguish them from the people and the culture. But if you're talking about Irish culture, it's Celts. Anglo-Saxons is synonymous with the English, Franks with the French, Vandals with the Spanish, Huns and Goths, they're the ones that came through as well. Now, the German contribution was tribal loyalty, and they actually preached a type of scruff democracy. Remember, so under Roman law, the emperor or the king is above the law. But in the Germans, they would sit around and the tribe would discuss, and the tribe would have a vote. And so tribal law started to be dominant. In other words, a chief could be replaced. And this is a rough form of democracy. And in the French language, when they started to talk and to discuss, it's called parler. And that's where the word parliament comes from. And obviously, this is very important for American history. When you think of the Middle Ages, they were capable of great deeds in architecture and these beautiful Gothic cathedrals. If you travel to Europe, these are great tourist attractions. And we also have these beautiful cathedrals as well. They tend to be Catholic in the United States. And the whole idea was when you entered this, and most people were poor, you felt like you were in heaven and overwhelmed by the beauty. And that's a rose window, okay, on the far right. The most famous cathedral is probably Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And some of you may know that this beautiful cathedral, which was started in 1163, right? And there's the famous Gothic rose window inside. Okay. But in 2019, it caught on fire. And although it looks like, how could that burn? Because it is all, it seems, rock, but the internal structure, the skeleton, was wood. And what a sight. I mean, they were in tears, many of the Parisians, they watched this. This is one of the most iconic and most beautiful things in all of Paris and France and in Europe for that matter. There's the Eiffel Tower behind it. And you can see the parts that burned down, the spire collapsed, the roof, all that came down because they were wooden structures. And they are rebuilding it. And they're using the same methods that were used during the Middle Ages to try to get this back together again. Now, what about the people who lived in this time period? The class structure. These class structures were very rigid. If you were born into one of these structures, you never left it. There was no sense of trying to improve yourself. If you were born a peasant, you were going to die a peasant. Okay. And this is the hierarchy. And the top would be the king, and then the nobles. And these were probably related to the king or some of the other major families. And under them would be the knights and the vassals. Vassals would be those who owned allegiance to the nobles. And then we have merchants and farmers and craftsmen and peasants who worked the land. And these didn't own the land. That's the difference between farmers and peasants. And then the lowest of the low would be serfs, which were basically slaves. They could not leave the land. They were tied to the land. And of course, this will vary from country to country, but you cannot escape from your class structure. And as you can see, most people were poor and exploited, and the rich, small in number, but had all the power. You should know about the medieval papacy. Papacy is another word for the Catholic Church, head by the Church and the Pope. Now, in the Roman Catholic Church, they have what they call the Petrine Doctrine, which is still in existence today. This is a Renaissance painting, and you can see Jesus giving the keys to the kingdom. See the key to St. Peter. And the keys to the kingdom, meaning that you will run the church. He didn't give the keys to all the apostles, but just to one. And Peter, that's where the word Petrine comes from. And that's why he is considered the first pope. So to this day, if you wonder, why does the Pope have so much power? Why don't, like the Protestants don't have a Pope? It's because of this, which is in the Bible, and it's taken to mean that Christ wanted one leader of the church, the Pope. And that explains that a little bit more. Once again, you can look at this at your own leisure, okay? Now, also, there were those who lived in what we call monastic orders, and they decided to devote their entire lives to the church. Many of them initially lived almost like homeless people. They lived in the desert. They're into harsh conditions. And eventually, they created what we call monastic communities, kind of separating themselves from everyday life. And many of them are still around today, and they have become really quite important. Often they lived alone, and that's where the word monk comes from. And then they eventually formed communities, and some of these still exist today. And you may have heard of some of these: Benedict, the Carmelites, Order of Friars, Franciscan Order, Dominican Order. And some of our universities are also based on these orders. And obviously the kings and queens that ran everything. This is very important to our story. I just picked out two here: Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, who will launch Columbus, for example. And once again, according to Roman law, God gave these people the right to rule, and to disobey them was a mortal sin. The nobles lived often in castles, and if you go to Europe today, these are great tourist attractions. Some are still owned by families, but many of them you can visit, and you can see why people like to visit them today. This is a lawless time. They didn't have very often, you had to have your own private army, and you can see how the only way to protect yourself was to be living in something like this, sometimes with a drawbridge, and to protect yourself from enemies. The lords and ladies, you can see they had the money, and people dressed to show their wealth, to show who they were. Okay. And there's some other examples of fashions. These are people with money. And there's that medieval castle again. You can tell this is a modern photograph. And there's the moat to protect them. This is one of the most famous castles in Scotland, where my family is from. Now, feudalism is a highly developed type of government where no centralized government existed. In other words, you lived in the countryside, the king was far away. So the nobles had all the power. They were the courts, They were the justice. They protected you. And they also pretty much owned all the land, and they would rent out the land. So the vassals served the nobles. One of the things they had to do was agree to fight for the nobles for 40 days. They had 40 days of military service. They had to attend and advise the nobles, wait on them if necessary, advise them. They had to sit in the court. And if a noble was captured, very often, instead of killing them, what the enemies would want to do would be to basically ransom them off for money. And so if you're the leader of the nobles in your district was taken prisoner, who was going to raise the money? Well, it'd be the common people and the vassals to pay that ransom. And also these people had to pay a fee to get married or to use the mills to grind their corn and so forth. And so it's not a fair system, but there is this mutual thing here. I will protect you if you serve me. That's basically what feudalism is about. And once again, just another one of those pyramids to kind of show this in maybe another way. Okay, the privileged versus non-privileged. And of course, the knights. Everyone knows about the knights. Some of you have been to King Richard's Fair in southeastern Massachusetts, Carver. And you've seen a number of movies about this and a little bit about the knights. Okay. Remember I said this is just background material. You can read this at your own leisure. Okay. There's some pictures of them. They remember no firearms yet. Okay. There are three types of soldiers: the foot soldiers and the archers. And later, the archers proved to be very lethal against the knights. High-powered bow sometimes could penetrate their armor, and they were really kind of key. But the knights, heavily armored, were like shock troops. Think of them as almost tanks in a way. And you had to be rich to be able to obviously be a knight. Think of the expense of the armor, the weapons, and the powerful war horse. But Hollywood is really, I know you're so familiar with these people from the countless movies that are out there. Okay, jousting, which is a sport in Maryland, by the way. The state sport of Maryland is jousting, and they do this at King Richard's Fair in Carver. Some of you may have been there. It'll be this fall, by the way. Just more views of this. And how do you become a knight? To this day, if you're knighted, like Queen Elizabeth of England was to knight someone, you take the sword, you tap them on both shoulders and the top of the head, and you declare them now a knight. And you get to say "Sir" in front of your name. The famous Beatle Paul McCartney was knighted by Queen, so he is Sir McCartney, Sir Paul McCartney. Needless to say, they don't serve in the service and the army anymore, but it's an old tradition that goes back to when knights were very important. And this is a neat picture of a knight's home taken today. So some of this stuff has been turned into whether condos or home for a rich person maybe, but you can see how well they were built because this building's in good shape and exists to this day. Now, another group of people are what we call the middle class. This is a word I do want you to know. I'm going to use it a lot in the course. It's called the bourgeoisie. And think of them as the people who live in the cities, the middle class. Many Americans like to think of themselves as middle class. You're not super rich, but you're not really poor. You might own a home, or you have a pretty good lifestyle. And so middle class. And this picture says it all. Notice they tend to be businessmen. Merchants. There's a picture of a merchant. Bankers. This is interesting. This is where the word bank comes from. They would set up a banki, which is a table like this, and then they would serve their customers, exchanging money and so forth. And from these bankis or tables comes the word bank. There's a money changer and his wife taking currency from one area and obviously deciding how much this is worth versus another. And most currency was based on gold and silver back then. What's in a name? I've used the term Middle Ages already, but many scholars like to feel that it's better to use the word medieval, because Middle Ages seems to imply it's like the middle of something. The glories of Rome versus the rise of the Renaissance, where we begin the course. So medieval probably is a better term to use. I've used Middle Ages here because it seemed to be more familiar with people, but it's the same thing, medieval. Now, very important where there are, remember I said that Europe was Christian at this point, but there's one group of people who were not Christian. And this goes all the way back to the time of Jesus, because Jesus was a Jew. And initially, his followers, who were all Jewish, And when they realized that many Jews were not going to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, there became a split. And Paul, as he traveled, made the point that you don't have to be Jewish to become a Christian. And so what happens, especially after the Romans adopted Christianity, the Jews became a minority in much of Europe. And because they stood out as being different, and they were often persecuted, or they were put into jobs that Christians didn't want. Now, this may seem strange to you, but back in the Catholic Church, the charged interest was considered a sin. And so what sometimes people did was use Jews as money lenders because they're not Christians, so they could do the money lending. So people would take loans from Jews and so forth. But because they were lending money, people developed a dislike for them as well. I've often thought that Jews were considered a threat because when you saw a Jew, which means he does not believe Jesus is God, that's a threat to that. Like, what if he's right and I'm wrong? So sometimes they had to wear strange hats. And basically this sense of anti-Semitism took hold. And we're dealing with that today in our own country. Today, anti-Semitism is on the rise like never before. And Jewish communities are sometimes threatened. This has been a curse on Western civilization we're dealing with in the course. Now, the other group in the cities are the artisans. These are workers, pretty much. And they're the ones, as you can see, specialized in making everything from rich tables and furniture and so forth. And this kind of speaks for itself, okay? And they had guilds, which would be like unions in a sense, that you belong to a guild, and they would, you would be, they would take an apprentice and they would teach them the skills. And that's pretty much how it worked. Okay, and they also kind of protected you in the guild. And so it was a very important skill. And as you can see, they each had different symbols. And some of the great artists and so forth started off this way, because when people first started seeing artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo, they considered them as regular workers, like in a guild. They didn't see them as being some kind of above and beyond geniuses. There's a guild sign. Can you tell what it would be? Look at the scissors. Okay. That's another one. Bauhaus. These are some of the rules in a guild. Remember I said this is just background material for. So if you hear the word guild in the course, I would hope I don't have to explain it to you again. That's the whole purpose of this PowerPoint, okay? What about women? Once again, this is something that we're still dealing with, but we'll talk more about this in the course. How did women become dominated by men? And of course they were. They're subordinate to the males, whether their father, husband, or other kinsmen. And up until the 20th century, very often they couldn't even own property, okay? When widows, however, were allowed much control of their own lives, but still restricted. And once again, you don't need me to have you read through this carefully. Okay. And spinning was one of the skills that women were expected to know and to, this once again, you don't need me to read this to you. So I will just let you look at it. And once again, as you go through this PowerPoint, you can slow it down and spend as much time on this slide or any slide that you want. And if you weren't going to get married, and you got married usually at puberty, the only other career open to you, if you want to call it a career, was to go into the church as a nun. Okay. And then we go with the Jews, and I just wanted once again establish this. They've spread all over Europe, and as you can see, they settled Germany and England and Spain under the Muslims, because the Muslims controlled Spain for a long time, and they actually treated the Jews better than the Christians did. Okay. Now, medieval cities. This is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I think you'll agree. Mont Saint-Michel, I had the privilege of being there once. And when the tide is up, you can see it's cut off. And when the tide goes out, it's surrounded by mud flats. And all these cities had to be heavily fortified because of the lawlessness, of course. And this is in France, and one of the most beautiful cities, I think, in the world. Imagine living in it. And there it is up on a hill. See? And there's another one. You can see the old wall, and it's up high in a mountain for protection. Modern day picture of a French city. Now this one, another one, look at, you can see how it was fortified. Look at the fortifications around the city. Now, of course, today there's been urban sprawl and it goes beyond the center of the city, but you can see the impact of the Middle Ages on Europe even today. If you go to any major city and you're going to find a fortress or a castle. There's one in France today. Kind of cool, huh? Another one, see? And just a modern day picture of what actually a dark and gloomy street might have looked like in some of these cities. And of course, the peasants. Peasant by definition works the land. These would have been the poorest people very often, okay? And now remember, the manorial system is basically how you set up life on these in these peasant communities. Once again, you can read this for yourself. Remember, the lord or the nobleman controls all the land, and a portion of a manor not granted to free tenants was either retained by the lord for his own use, an occupation, or occupied by his serfs. Okay. And nearby would be a fortified dwelling or manor house of the lord. And this kind of gives you a breakdown how it would be. Notice the manor house, and notice it was a small community, all able to survive by itself pretty much. Fallow means that they would leave one field without plants, so the nitrogens, not that they understood this totally, could enrich the soil. So if you had a 3-field system, you'd only have used planting in 2 of the fields, and 1 field would be fallow, and then you rotate them through. Common lands would be that everyone could use the land in green. Boston Common. Later, every city would have like a common, and that was just what that implies, that you could get your firewood, you could bring your goats and sheep to use the common land. It was for everyone's use. And this might be another way how it might look in practicality. This is how most people lived. Okay, now life was short. There's no doctors, no medicine. People lived short lives, basically. Okay, there's another view of a peasant village. Another view. And this is a peasant home. One thing you might be surprised about, that there was only one room. Everyone lived inside the house, including some of your barn animals. There's no privacy. When the husband and wife decided to have sex, the kids might be in the same room and actually observing everything. It kind of goes against our sensibilities, but that's what life was like. The only good thing about living with your animals, and they lived in the same house with you, let's not talk about cleanliness, is that man started to pick up, Europeans started to pick up the diseases of these animals, and they developed antibodies. Today, almost all our flus come from animals, okay? The typical European peasant was a farm laborer, not much better than a slave, really. Single room, see? What it might look like inside. You can see how they easily picked up diseases from animals, but also the antibodies. This will play a major role when they go to the New World, because when they go to what is today North and South America, the Native Americans did not have horses or goats and pigs, and they were not immune to the diseases that the Europeans brought. When the Pilgrims came to Plymouth, about 90% of all the Native Americans were dead in Massachusetts, what would someday be Massachusetts, because of disease. You had one single pair of clothing. You never traveled further than your feet could carry you. No medical attention. Illiterate. Potatoes were luxury, and they didn't have potatoes until after the 1400s. And everyone was malnourished. Everyone was malnourished. And once again, that's how God wanted it. If your house burned down, it was God's will. And God ordained that you would be poor the rest of your life. It was God's will that you be a peasant. And everyone knew your place and no one questioned it. There was no sense of like, oh, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to improve my lot, and I'm going to become someday a nobleman. Not going to happen. Okay, you suffered from chronic hunger. And the only thing you could eat was bread, pretty much. You couldn't shoot animals, or not shoot, I'm sorry about that. You couldn't hunt animals because they were only for the nobleman, for his hunting purposes. And if you killed some of the game, that's poaching, and you could be put to death for that. You didn't have a name. If you did have a name, it was what you did. So that's why Smith is one of the most common names in the English language. You were a smithy, you worked as a blacksmith. The view of the world was only what you could travel and see. Remember? And if you walked, went too far from home, you could never get back because there are no roads. Okay. And the view of themselves was like, you know, life is miserable and the only hope I have is heaven. Lifespan, women died very often in childbirth. A girl from the Highlands of Scotland might be pregnant 22 times if she was lucky enough to live that long, but out of 22 pregnancies, maybe 5 or 6 children would live. And you'll notice a lot of men had more than one wife because they lost a wife in childbirth. There was no such thing as, cleanliness. They didn't know anything about germs. And so it's a very limited existence. You're lucky you're living when you are, I guess. Okay, that's how they dressed. Peasant is a famous painting, and from the Renaissance, and gives you a good sense of notice the bagpipes, although this is not Scotland, bagpipes were throughout Europe. Another kind of picturesque view, kind of a positive view, I guess. It's like a happy life there, but don't let that fool you. And that's the world in 1300. Okay, they did not know about North and South America. You want to remember that, Europeans. We talked about the keys to the kingdom already. The Catholic Church was dominant. Now, the reason for this, go back to the Catholic Church for a minute. Oops, sorry. Their connection to the Holy Land was very important, and a very important thing happened with the rise of Islam. They took over the Holy Land, and so they decided to have crusades to win back the Holy Land, like Jerusalem, for example. And the crusades are very important. There were a number of crusades, and basically, in the end, they failed. The Muslims held on to the Holy Land, as we call it today. It would be what is now Egypt. I'm sorry, yeah, part of Egypt, but also Israel, Palestine, that type of area, Lebanon, that whole coast. But the important thing about this is that they came in contact with different foods and spices in the Middle East that the people in the Middle East had, but in Europe they did not. See, spices. Now, think about this. They had no spices like this. These all came out of Asia pretty much, and they were carried into the Middle East by merchants. Can you imagine for the first time having pepper or any of these rich cinnamon, for example? And these were more, and these were worth more than gold and silver, okay? These spices. Once Sir Francis Drake had 2 ships that he had taken from the Spanish. One was filled with gold and silver. The other was filled with spices, the kind of spices that you could buy in your neighborhood store. And one of the ships was going down. He decided to let the gold and silver sink, but keep the spices. It tells you how invaluable they were. And of course, this is how they came into the Middle East. From China, it's what we call the Silk Road. And silk also traveled to Europe this way, and Europeans didn't know how to make silk. And this sets you up for the age of exploration. Could we get to China and Asia without having the middlemen, the Muslims in the middle, for example, like Arabia, having them as middlemen, meaning the price of everything was going up. Also, at this point, the Mongols, now look in the 1200s, also came out of Asia. And this was probably the most extensive invasion in world history. They conquered an area using their horse that's greater than the Roman Empire. And there they go. You can see out of Mongolia, tremendous, incredible horsemen. Okay, and they conquered China. They conquered much of India, the Middle East, and they also conquered what is today Russia and Ukraine, but they didn't get into Europe. Notice where it says Germany and France and Italy, they were stopped. Okay, a little bit about the Mongols. But what they did do was they were brutal. If you fought them, they would wipe you out, and they would make mountains of skulls, for example. But if you gave in to them, then they pretty much would, let you live and carry on. But they brought peace as well, Pax Mongolica, which means that it helped the dissemination and exchange of trade. See that the last sentence is important. That once they brought peace, that you could travel and goods started to travel between East and West. Once again, you don't need me to read this. This is meant for you to read. Okay. And there's the famous Genghis Khan, who conquered much of this empire. And then when he died, of course, it would be carried on by his own children and just some visuals of the Mongols. And you can see the Mongol Empire at its height. And then it broke up into different khanates or groups once Genghis Khan died. But pretty much this had a tremendous impact on Russia, for example, because Russia is not going to participate in what we call the Renaissance that Western Europe did because they were under the rule of the Mongols. We'll talk more about that in the course. And there's just another example of how fast and how much land that they were able to conquer and control. This is very important, okay? Another view of this. Even the word horde, it means like a large group, right? The Golden Horde. Look at yellow, that area would be Russia and the Ukraine. And you can see the green, which would be China, of course. And they pretty much were stopped finally in Eastern Europe in 1362. And there's a reconstruction of a Mongol warrior. This is interesting in terms of DNA. 16 million men are related to Genghis Khan. It's not surprising when you consider Genghis Khan had 500 wives and concubines, mistresses, and the ruling Khans in other parts of the Mongol Empire were equally busy. They had about 800 years to multiply. Still, it's amazing. Some of you may have Genghis Khan DNA. Now, one of the things they did, which would be obviously harmful, and they didn't do this on purpose, we're going through our own pandemic, as you know, with COVID. They helped spread what was known as the Black Death. Nothing like armies moving on the road and disease. People had no concept of what disease was back then. But you can see how sometimes they used disease corpses and to catapult them into the enemy cities and then to spread infections. And some Italian traders from Genoa later brought the plague, not knowingly, to Europe, and where it rapidly spread. And look what happened at that last sentence. The total number of deaths worldwide from the pandemic is estimated at 75 million people, an estimated 20 million deaths in Europe alone. Okay. And you can see what a horrible time this was in Europe, caused by famine. Also, slow transition from the medieval warm period to the ice age, when everything started to get very severe bad weather, winters, and so forth. Once again, you can read this without me. Once again, about the Black Death. And people didn't know, had no cure for this. They were dumping bodies in the river, while downriver they were taking water out of the river to drink, okay? And sometimes if someone had the Black Death, they would lock them into their house and brick the walls, the doors so they couldn't get out and spread. Now we know today what caused it. It was caused basically by a flea, by bacteria on a flea, which was carried on a mouse or rat. And since everyone lived with rats, they were everywhere, it was very easy for this disease to spread. Okay. There's the bacterium, which causes the plague. And it tells you a little bit about how it goes onto the flea. Of course, the flea is living on the rat, and the rest of the story. And death in 2 or 3 days. You can see why they call it the Black Death. And we still can find now, then we find victims of the Black Death. These skeletons were discovered in Lincolnshire, England. Okay. And once again, you don't need me for this, but it explains how it spread. Narrow streets, all the garbage was in the street. There were no toilets to speak of, and malnourishment, no crude personal hygiene. It's no wonder, right? And once again, I hope you find this interesting, some interesting stories about this Black Death. And of course, they thought it was caused by the devil, by Jews. Sometimes Jews were always an interesting scapegoat. They were poisoning the water and stuff like that. So there's a great rise of anti-Semitism during this. Just like, unfortunately, believe it or not, the anti-Semitism has risen also because of COVID. Now here you come up, I think, with a great costume for Halloween. medieval English medicine and technology. As you know, they were very ill suited to deal with this. Notice the barber pole. Barbers were also surgeons. That's where that pole comes from. Notice I love to bleed people. That was a very popular thing to do. It's like use leeches to suck blood out of people, thinking that the bad blood would come out that way. Or nothing wrong with drilling a hole in someone's head to remove bad spirits. Okay. And once again, some key events about the Black Death. This is the costume. Plague doctors. I love this outfit. And I went to some details on this because I'm going to dress up like this for Halloween, I think. And it's a very easy costume. Once again, you can look at this at your own leisure. There it is. Pretty scary, huh? Now it breaks down for the hat. See, what's the hat for? Wide-brimmed hats were used to partially shield doctors from the bacteria, it was thought. The beak, this is the key, and you can buy these, by the way, online. Spread by birds. We now know that rats and fleas were responsible. Doctors may have thought that dressing up like a bird-like gas mask, the plague would be transferred from the patient to the garment. This beak piece was also filled with vinegar, sweet oils, and other strong-smelling chemicals to mask the stench of death on unburied bodies. Red eyepieces to keep them free from the evil eye. And that black overcoat, I'm sure you can find something similar to that in your closet. Okay, it's the mask that really makes the costume, huh? I would not cover it with suet or fat, however. That would not go over very well to go out with your friends, but that's what they did. And the cane speaks for itself. And there's that spice trade again, which was so important, but also helped with spreading the plague. So as we come, this last part here, there's three distinct cultures, political powers in the West. There's Islam, the barbarian kings of the West, which we're really dealing with, and Byzantium, and hopefully now you all know about Byzantium. These are the barbarian kings, okay? And in this course, we'll see how they turn into modern Europe. There's Byzantium in the orange, okay? Which won't be the center part of our story, but we're going to be talking about Byzantium, so I want you to know what I'm talking about. And then there's the Arab or Islamic Empire, the Arab Caliphate. Now, briefly here, what I'm going to do, there's modern Europe to kind of put this in perspective. The Islam religion was a fast spreading. This is another one of those incredible movements. The Arabs were aroused by a new faith. Muhammad died in 632, and look at how fast they spread. They spread throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and what's key here, notice they also took over Spain, and they could very well have conquered all of Europe, in which case we would be Muslims today and not Christian, probably. And then there's their holy city, Mecca, see in the dark green. Now, what you should know about them is that this civilization was one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world. If I was in a time machine, I'd want to live in the Islamic area, not Western Europe, where they're dealing with plague and superstition, okay? And this is the golden age of Islam, as we call it. And all I've done here is list some of their contributions. And I think you'll see why they are so important and why I would rather live in this civilization than any other if I was in a time machine, okay? These are the things they've given us: algebra, geometry, calculus, optics, and chemistry. These are all subjects we probably have taught and have taken in school. Algebra, you can see the connection to the word Arab. And they led the world, pretty much. The decimal system, multiplication, division, all these things that we take for granted today, we owe them. Navigation and geography, once again, stuff that you can look at your own leisure. Ibn Battuta was a great explorer, if you will, and you can see in the green areas, he traveled all over the Muslim world. Medicine. They were closer to understanding what medicine is really all about, okay? Astronomy. We could not have discovered the new world without the astrolabe and the compass, okay? Now, the compass was invented by the Chinese, but we got it through the Arabs. Okay. And now the China, that was the superpower of the day. It's interesting that China is also a major power today, isn't it? Maybe the greatest threat to the United States in terms of an economic powerhouse. And during this time, their empire also was far advanced of Western Europe. Look at their ship. Look at the size of their junk versus Columbus's ship, the little one there. Okay, they were 500 years ahead in seafaring technology. There's another view of that. They had watertight compartments. The contributions are the compass and also something called porcelain. I know you don't get excited about porcelain, but Europeans were eating out of wooden bowls. And so they have something as delicate as eggshell, beautiful designs like this, and they did not know how to make it. This was a major item that kings and the rich wanted from Asia, meaning China. They also invented, can you guess what this would be? A high-powered, what you call it, to shoot arrows. They invented printing. This is how printing came to the West from the Chinese. And paper, they invented paper. What did Europeans use? They used animal skin, okay, basically, before that. And printing, blocks of printing. Gunpowder, they invented gunpowder. We don't have to belabor that in terms of how it's going to change the world. And thank God for this, they invented toilet paper. I know the question comes up then, what did Europeans use? Well, let your imagination go. There's nothing like, a stick or, worse comes to worse, your hand. But the Chinese, which was so much cleaner than Europeans, actually had toilet paper. And of course, rockets. They like to use them mostly for fireworks, but of course, I don't have to, again, explain how rockets and gunpowder will lead to the development of guns. And the Crusades, of course, why I'm back here is this is how the West learned about these inventions. The Crusades helped bring the European desire for them. So the conclusion, why the West? This was the least likely area of the world to become a major power. And in this course, we're going to see how that happened. Because if you were a betting man, you would have thought Islam, the Islamic Empire, or the Chinese Empire would be the dominant one in the world, even up until the 21st century. Okay, this is where we begin our course. The Renaissance, which means like a rebirth, and in many ways, that's when Western Europe starts to pick up and rediscover the glories of Rome and Greece, and that philosophy I started with. Okay, now in the Middle Ages, it was about man, and man, of course, is subordinate to God. He did not have his own identity. Kind of like man wasn't really capable of too much. God was dominant, science was non-existent, and politics was all power to the king. When we start this course, by the way, scholasticism is this idea of just kind of like taking what was learned from the Middle Ages and not questioning it at all. There was very little questioning. And science, it was about Aristotle. They did approve of him and his views of science. Now the Renaissance is going to be a little different. Now there's going to be an emphasis on man, humanism. Aristotle is still the view of science. In other words, what Aristotle said, everyone kind of believes, and he was wrong about a lot of things. Politics, it's going to be now about not just the king knows everything, but that people can make history. It's not about God deciding who wins the battle. It's about people making decisions. And that ties in with humanism, of course. And God, it's a Catholic God. I want to stress this. There's no Protestantism. It's Catholic Church. Okay, we have humanism, Catholic Church, the Greek views of science, and a key breakthrough here, when you look at this, is man and politics. And these are going to become major points of contention. So I know this is long, and once again, just look at it slowly at your own pace, but this will help you as we pick up the course, because I'm going to assume I can just start right off with the Renaissance.